Hi, welcome back to Kin 3030 Online. Today we're just going to continue on the torque lecture and muscle usage and actually put it together with what we did in muscle in terms of what is an agonist and what's an antagonist and what's eccentric and what's concentric. So we have to recognize that the net joint torque is the addition, that sum of sine, all of the torques that cross, that are created by muscles across the joint. So if you have more than one muscle crossing a joint, each one of those muscles can create a torque and you add them up. Some of them will be creating a torque in one direction and some will be creating a torque in the opposite direction. And you sort of add the ones that are going in one direction and subtract the ones that are going in the other direction, so you get your net torque. And whichever direction that is your agonist. So if I have my biceps and maybe brachioradialis on, they're creating a flexor torque, and then I have my triceps on at the same time creating an extensor torque. And it turns out that there's more flexor torque than there is extensor torque. When I add them up, I add on the biceps, subtract off the triceps, and if it's still a positive value, and I've said flexor is positive, then flexors are the agonist muscles. So the net joint torque. And what you end up with is a graph like these graphs. And so as you go through a range of motion, in this case it's a gait cycle, you can see the person walking across the top, and you can see you have the swing portion of the gait cycle and the stance portion of the gait cycle. This is for one leg. It swings and then it's in stance. And you have two graphs here. You have a hip graph and a knee graph. And within each of those graphs, there's two separate curves. One of them has to do with the muscle itself, the muscle torque, and the other one has to do with the joint angular velocity. The muscle torque is the solid line curve, and the joint angular velocity is the dotted line. So, as you go through that range, through the whole curve along, as you go along the gait cycle, essentially, sometimes the solid line is above zero and sometimes it's below zero. And what that sign tells you is which one is the agonist muscle. So, the agonist muscle, if it's positive, then whatever you define as the positive muscle is the agonist muscle. Now, you need to look very carefully in each graph as to what is positive and what is negative. It shows on both graphs. It's different for both graphs. So in the hip graph, it's the flexors that are positive. So whenever the net joint torque is positive, that means the hip flexors are the agonist muscle. If the net joint torque curve is negative, that means the hip flexors are the agonist muscle. And it flips for the two graphs. And once you decide what is positive and what's negative, there's no magical, we know because we're biomechanists, this is positive and this is negative. There are some rules that can be used in certain situations. And I mean, if you're working with a group, you kind of might come to a consensus that this is positive and this is negative. But essentially it comes back to what the main researcher or the main person in charge of the study or how you're collecting data decided to draw the free body diagram in the first place. Here we have a typical free body diagram for calculating the joint torque at the knee. We have the calf and foot as one segment. We, of course, had to chop through the knee because if you want to find out what's going on at a joint, you have to chop through that joint. You see, this would be what we considered before a pin joint constrained. Pin joint constrained means we're showing the muscles as a torque instead of as a muscle force that is pulling. And we have our joint forces, we have our force due to gravity, and most importantly, we have that torque being created by the muscles at the knee, as I've drawn it there. As I've drawn it there, look at it and you can see that it would be pulling up your leg. That's as you draw it, you can almost see it trying to twist up the foot from the ground. That's what the extensors do, isn't it? So, if my torque is going in the direction that I've drawn it there, that means the extensors are the muscle group, and that would be positive. So however I drew my arrow is what I'm considering positive. And if I calculated my net joint torque and it was actually going in the opposite direction, I wouldn't change my arrow direction. What I would do is I would assign it a sign of negative. Negative just means it's going opposite from how I drew it. In this case, negative would mean the knee flexors, the hamstrings. So back to our curves. Again, top one hip, second one there is the knee. And the next part we really want to talk about is what is the agonist and what is the antagonist? As I said, that whenever the curve is positive, it's that muscle is the agonist. So when the hip curve is positive, that means those flexors are active. And think about it, at the beginning of swing, you're starting to bring your leg through. So you're going to turn on these hip flexors to swing your leg through. And then before the end of swing, you're going to want to slow that hip down, that leg down, so that it can be at a zero velocity when it actually hits the ground. So you're going to start with these hip flexors. They're going to turn on and be the agonist muscle, and they're going to actively bring your leg through. And then you're going to turn on your extensors for the last part of swing, and you can see that the solid line going into the negative. I'm going to turn on my glutes to slow things down so that my foot is ready to hit the ground. So that makes sense. And as I said, now, in that first part, when I've got my flexors on, that means my flexors are the agonist muscle, because they're the muscle that have to be on to do what I want to have happen. Does that mean the antagonist muscle is not on? So are the glutes not on? Well, not necessarily. You can have your antagonist muscle on. We've talked about this before. The antagonist muscle could be on. It doesn't have to be on. Could be off. You don't know. All you know is that whatever torque it creates is less than the torque of the muscle on the other side. So whenever, again, the flexors are the agonist muscles, the extensors would be the antagonist muscle, and as soon as the curve crosses zero and goes to the other side, that relationship flips. again, as I said, the antagonist muscles are by definition the muscles that work opposite the agonist muscle, meaning they don't do what you want to have happen. And they may or may not be on. You can't tell from these curves. You can't tell from these curves. Now, mind you, if they are on, so if I turn on my hip flexors and I also turn on my hip extensors, I actually have to turn on my hip flexors a little bit more to overcome the torque created by the hip extensors. That's why I've said it can be a little inefficient. There are times when it's appropriate, but it can be a little inefficient. Next thing, we know which muscle is agonist. We know the agonist muscle has to be on, and the antagonist muscle doesn't have to be on. But is the muscle on acting eccentrically or concentrically? To figure that part out, we need more information because remember, for a muscle to be concentric or eccentric, it needs to be either shortening or lengthening, right? So we not only need to know whether it's on or not, because that tells us that it's active. So it has to be activated and shortening or lengthening. So we know the agonist muscle is on. That's the definition. And so we need that extra information to figure out if it's on and shortening or on and lengthening. And we get that from the velocity curve. Ultimately, if the velocity is going in the same direction as the muscle that's on, then it's shortening. It's a concentric contraction. If they're in opposite directions, then it's lengthening, and it's an eccentric contraction. So in the first part there, on the hip, you can see, again, we're here, we're going to bring our leg through in swing, and we're turning on our hip flexors, and we are flexing our hip, and the velocity shows flexing, and the agonist muscle shows flexors. It is by definition right there, we can say the flexors are the agonist muscle, and they are acting concentrically because they are shortening. If we look there at the beginning of the knee, though, you can see that as you start to go through swing here, you actually are bending your knee a bit, which kind of makes sense so that you clear and you don't hit the floor. But at the same time, we turn on our quads to control that bending so that it doesn't bend too much. If we just let it relax, it might bend more than we want. So we actually turn on our quads a bit during that swing. Even though our knee is flexing, the extensors have to turn on to control how much it flexes. And you can see there very clearly, the solid line is positive, and in the knee, a positive value are the extensors, being the agonist muscle, and the dotted line, the velocity, is negative, meaning the knee is flexing. Well, the extensors are on. They're going in opposite direction, which means you have the extensors as the agonist muscle, and they are acting eccentrically. So I hope that clears how you can look at the knee torque, or any joint torque, and how it is the sum of all the muscles creating a torque over that joint. Now, typically in the same plane, so we'd be adding all the flexors and extensors together. So adding the flexors, subtracting the extensors, or vice versa, depending what sign you wanted to use. And then we would do the abductors, adductors separately. So it's kind of within a plane. But you can create these graphs and see throughout a movement what muscle group you would expect to have active.